Red arrows swept eastward, confident and clean, stretching deep into Soviet territory. On paper, the campaign promised speed, collapse, and victory before winter could arrive. It was the largest invasion in human history, planned with certainty, ambition, and belief. But one man was staring at the same maps and seeing something else. Not triumph, not momentum, but distance. He saw roads that would disappear into mud, supply lines stretched beyond reason, an enemy that did not collapse when surrounded, but retreated only to return again. He warned that the war would not end in weeks, that Moscow would not fall easily, that Germany was walking into a conflict it could not finish. The warning reached the highest levels, it was acknowledged, then ignored. Because Operation Barbarossa had already become more than a plan. It had become faith. Faith in speed, faith in superiority, faith that ideology could bend reality. When the invasion began, history would remember shock, scale, and surprise. What it would not remember is that someone inside the machine had tried, quietly, to slow it down. His name was Friedrich Paulus, and before the war would know him as a defeated commander, he was a man who understood that the real danger was not the enemy ahead, but the certainty behind him. By the spring of 1941, Germany believed it stood at the peak of history. France had fallen with stunning speed. Western Europe lay subdued. Britain remained defiant but isolated. Inside Berlin, confidence hardened into doctrine. War, it was believed, could be decided by momentum alone. Strike fast enough, deep enough, and resistance would collapse before it could organize. Operation Barbarossa was born from that belief. The Soviet Union was viewed not as a strategic opponent, but as a brittle structure held together by fear and ideology. German planners assumed that once struck, it would fracture, politically, militarily, psychologically. Cities would fall, armies would be encircled. The campaign would be over before logistics or weather could interfere. But this assumption rested on fragile ground. The eastern distances were unlike anything Germany had faced. Rail gauges were incompatible. Roads were poor or non-existent. Fuel and ammunition would need to travel farther each week, through territory that destroyed infrastructure as it retreated. Even a successful advance risked outrunning its own supply. Some officers saw this clearly. They warned that speed without sustainability was not strength, that destroying enemy formations meant little if replacements could be raised faster than they could be eliminated. That winter was not an abstract concept, but a certainty written into geography. Most dangerously, they warned that ideology had replaced analysis. Barbarossa was not simply a military operation. It was framed as destiny, as a war of annihilation that would validate beliefs about superiority and inevitability. In that environment, skepticism sounded like disloyalty. Caution sounded like fear. This is why the moment mattered. Germany was not choosing between victory and defeat. It was choosing between limits and denial. To accept the warning would have meant admitting that the war could not be controlled by will alone, that resources, time, and reality still applied. But the machinery of planning had already accelerated beyond restraint. Millions of men were in position. Alliances were calibrated. Timetables were fixed to the calendar, not to conditions on the ground. To slow down now meant unraveling months of preparation and confronting doubts leaders no longer wished to entertain. So the warnings were absorbed but not acted upon. They were treated as theoretical concerns, not operational barriers, as risks to be managed later, not signals to reconsider now. The invasion was allowed to proceed under the assumption that success would resolve uncertainty. That assumption would shape everything that followed. When German forces crossed the border, the opening weeks seemed to confirm belief. Soviet units collapsed in massive encirclements. Territory fell faster than maps could be updated. To many, this appeared to validate the gamble. But beneath the surface, the warning was already becoming visible. Supply columns lagged. Equipment wore down faster than expected. The enemy did not disintegrate. It withdrew, reformed, and returned. Distance began to consume momentum. The question was no longer whether the warning had merit. It was whether it had arrived too early to stop the machine and too late to change its course. Friedrich Paulus was not a gambler. He had not risen through the ranks by daring raids or charismatic command. He advanced by calculation, by understanding logistics, coordination, and the quiet mechanics that allow armies to move at all. Where others focused on breakthroughs, Paulus focused on what made breakthroughs possible. This made him an unlikely dissenter in a system increasingly driven by belief. Before Barbarossa, Paulus worked where maps mattered more than medals. He studied distances, rail networks, fuel consumption, and the brutal arithmetic of supply. He knew how far an army could advance before momentum turned into exposure. And when he applied that arithmetic to the east, the result was unsettling. Germany could advance deep into Soviet territory, but it could not sustain that advance indefinitely. Paulus did not argue ideology, he argued limits. He pointed out that encirclement victories destroyed enemy units, but not the enemy's capacity to regenerate. That Soviet manpower and industrial depth were being underestimated. That rail conversions alone would slow supply to a crawl. That winter was not an if, but a when. These were not dramatic objections. They were administrative ones, and that made them dangerous. In a leadership culture that celebrated boldness, Paulus's caution sounded like obstruction. His warnings did not challenge the goal of invasion. They challenged the assumption that it could be finished quickly. That distinction mattered little to leaders who believed speed itself was the solution. Paulus understood the risk of speaking. He was not confronting an open debate. He was pushing against momentum fueled by recent victories and reinforced by ideology. Each success in the West had convinced leadership that doubt was weakness and restraint unnecessary. Yet Paulus persisted. He framed his concerns as planning adjustments, not opposition. He asked for contingencies, for realistic timetables, for recognition that the war might not end before winter and that Germany was not prepared for that reality. The response was polite and dismissive. His calculations were noted, his objections recorded. Then the conversation moved on. Barbarossa was not waiting for perfect certainty. It was waiting for execution. This left Paulus in a familiar but isolating position. He was inside the system, but no longer aligned with its assumptions. He was trusted with responsibility, but not with influence. His role became one of implementation rather than direction, ensuring that a plan he believed unsustainable was executed as efficiently as possible. This contradiction would define his fate. By the time the invasion began, Paulus was no longer arguing whether it should happen. He was ensuring it happened correctly. The line between warning and compliance blurred, not because he had changed his mind, but because the machinery had already moved beyond dissent. History would later remember Paulus for a different moment, one of surrender, far to the east. But that moment was rooted here, in the weeks before Barbarossa, when he understood that Germany was stepping into a war it could not finish. He did not stop it, but he saw it clearly. And in systems driven by certainty, seeing clearly can be its own kind of isolation. The first weeks of the invasion looked like vindication. German forces advanced at a pace that stunned observers. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Prisoners marched west in numbers so vast they blurred into abstraction. Maps filled with arrows pushing deeper into territory that had never before been breached so quickly. To many, this was proof that caution had been unnecessary, but to Friedrich Paulus, the success felt brittle. Behind the front lines, the warning he had voiced began to materialize. Not as catastrophe, but as strain. Fuel arrived late. Spare parts disappeared into distance. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. The further the army moved east, the more each kilometer cost. Speed was consuming itself. The Soviet response also defied expectation. Units did not collapse permanently when encircled. They disintegrated, regrouped, and reappeared. Factories dismantled themselves and moved beyond reach. New formations rose where defeat was supposed to end resistance. The war was not ending. It was stretching. As summer gave way to autumn, the illusion of inevitability began to erode. The distances Paulus had warned about now defined the campaign. Supply lines grew fragile. Coordination slowed. Decisions that once took hours now took days. Momentum bled away into geography. Then came the winter. The cold did not arrive as surprise. It arrived as consequence. Armies stalled not because they were unprepared for fighting, but because they were unprepared for duration. Equipment failed, men froze, logistics collapsed under conditions no timetable had accounted for. The gamble had matured into entrapment. What Paulus had feared was no longer theoretical. Germany had not lost because it lacked courage or capability. It lost because it had mistaken rapid success for strategic resolution. The enemy it expected to destroy had absorbed the blow and adapted, while Germany exhausted itself reaching for a victory that kept receding. Paulus's role shifted again, from planner to executor, from executor to commander, from commander to custodian of a reality no longer aligned with belief. The decisions made before Barbarossa now dictated the limits of every choice afterward. Retreat meant surrendering gains paid for in blood. Advance meant overextension without support. Holding position meant slow attrition. There were no good options left. The catastrophe that would later define the Eastern War did not erupt in a single moment. It unfolded gradually, as each assumption failed under pressure, and when the reckoning finally arrived, it felt less like surprise than confirmation. History often points to Stalingrad as the turning point, but Stalingrad was not where the war was lost. It was where the warning, first ignored in quiet rooms and polite meetings, finally became impossible to deny. By then, the cost of denial had multiplied beyond reversal. After the war, Germany's defeat demanded simple explanations. History gravitated toward villains and catastrophes, toward names that could carry blame cleanly. Operation Barbarossa became a symbol of ideological madness and strategic arrogance, and the focus narrowed to those who had willed it forward. In that telling, there was little room for the men who had warned against it from within. Friedrich Paulus was inconvenient to remember. He was neither a heroic resistor nor an unthinking zealot. He occupied the uncomfortable middle ground of a professional who saw the danger, articulated it, and still remained inside the system as it advanced. That ambiguity did not translate well into post-war narratives that sought moral clarity. There was also the problem of timing. Paulus's warning did not stop Barbarossa. The invasion proceeded. Early victories followed. For months, belief appeared justified. In history, warnings that do not prevent disaster are often treated as footnotes rather than foresight, especially when the disaster takes time to fully unfold. By the time Paulus's concerns were undeniably validated, attention had shifted elsewhere. Stalingrad consumed the narrative. It offered a dramatic arc: advance, encirclement, surrender. It was easier to frame defeat around a single battle than around a series of ignored calculations made years earlier. Paulus became remembered for capitulation, not for comprehension. That reduction was convenient. It allowed the failure of Barbarossa to be explained as collapse under pressure rather than as a decision made in denial of limits. It preserved the illusion that defeat came suddenly, rather than as the delayed consequence of warnings set aside. And there was a deeper discomfort. Acknowledging Paulus's foresight would have meant admitting that the catastrophe was not unforeseeable, that the limits of German power were understood before the invasion began, that the war was lost not because no one knew, but because knowing did not outweigh belief. So history simplified. It remembered the gamble. It remembered the collapse. It forgot the moment when restraint was still possible. Operation Barbarossa teaches a lesson older than the war itself. That momentum can silence arithmetic. That belief can overpower evidence. And that the most dangerous plans are those that begin with certainty rather than limits. Friedrich Paulus did not fail to understand the Eastern War. He understood it too early. His warning was not dramatic. It offered no alternative triumph. It did not promise victory through different means. It simply insisted that time, distance, and reality would not bend to will. In systems built on conviction, that kind of warning is the hardest to accept. The tragedy of Barbarossa is not that Germany underestimated its enemy. It is that it overestimated its ability to end the war on its own terms. The campaign did not collapse because of winter alone, or because of a single battle, or because of one commander's failure. It collapsed because a decision made in confidence outran the conditions required to sustain it. Paulus's story matters because it reveals how disasters are often chosen long before they are experienced, in conference rooms, in planning documents, in moments when slowing down feels more dangerous than moving forward. History remembers the end of the road. It rarely remembers the moment someone pointed out where it led. Barbarossa did not fail because it was badly executed. It failed because it should never have been expected to finish. And the man who understood that, quietly, precisely, was not remembered as a voice of foresight, but as a figure standing at the end of a path he had once tried to warn others not to take. That is why this story belongs here. Not as an excuse, not as redemption, but as a reminder that history does not punish ignorance alone. Sometimes it punishes certainty,